Good morning. I'm just learning how this works. Sorry, I'm a little delayed here because or YouTube is giving me an instruction and I have to find the key that relates to it. Okay, well, I can't find the key, so it's not very useful to me. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so um, yesterday I began reading from the practice of psychotherapy essays on the psychology of transference and other subjects by C.G. Jung. This is volume 16 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And yesterday I read the first half of an essay entitled Problems of Modern Psychotherapy. And so today I'm going to read the remainder of this section. I'll be beginning with paragraph 151 of this essay. So here goes. Paragraph 151. At this point in Freud's system of explanation, there is a palpable gap into which there stepped his one-time pupil, Adler. Adler has shown convincingly that numerous cases of neurosis can be far more satisfactorily explained by the power instinct than by the pleasure principle. The aim of his interpretation is therefore to show the patient that he arranges his symptoms, and explains his neurosis in order to achieve a fictitious importance, and that even his transference and his other fixations subserve the will to power and thus represent a masculine protest against imaginary suppression. Obviously, Adler has in mind, hold on a second. Obviously, Adler has in mind, Obviously, Adler has in mind the psychology of the underdog or social failure whose one passion is self-assertion. Such individuals are neurotic because they always imagine they are hard done by and tilt at the windmills of their own fancy, thus putting the goal they most desire quite out of reach. Paragraph 152. Adler's method begins essentially at the stage of elucidation. He explains the symptoms in the sense just indicated, and to that extent appeals to the patient's understanding. Yet it is characteristic of Adler that he does not expect too much of understanding, but going beyond that has clearly recognized the need for social education. Whereas Freud is the investigator and interpreter, Adler is primarily the educator. He thus takes up the negative legacy which Freud bequeathed him, and refusing to leave the patient a mere child, helpless despite his valuable understanding, tries by every device of education to make him a normal and adapted person. He does this evidently in the conviction that social adaptation and normalization are desirable goals. that they are absolutely necessary, the consummation of human life. From this fundamental attitude comes the widespread social activity of the Adlerian school, but also its depreciation of the unconscious, which it seems occasionally amounts to its complete denial. This is probably a swing of the pendulum, the inevitable reaction to the emphasis Freud lays on the unconscious, and as such, quite in keeping with the natural aversion which we noted in patients struggling for adaptation and health. For if the unconscious is held to be nothing more than a receptacle for all the evil shadow things in human nature, including deposits of primeval slime, we really do not see why we should linger longer than necessary on the edge of the swamp into which we once fell. The scientific inquirer may behold a world of wonders in a mud puddle, but for the ordinary man, it is something best left alone. Just as early Buddhism had no gods because it had to free itself from an inheritance of nearly 2 million gods, so psychology, if it is to develop further, must leave behind so entirely negative a thing as Freud's conception of the unconscious. The educational aim of the Adlerian school begin The educational aims of the Adlerian school begin precisely where Freud leaves off. Consequently, they meet the needs of the patient who, having come to understand himself, wants to find his way back to normal life. It is obviously not enough for him to know how his illness arose and whence it came, for we seldom get rid of an evil merely by understanding its causes. Nor should it be forgotten that the crooked paths of a neurosis lead to as many obstinate habits, and that for all insight, these do not disappear until replaced by other habits. But habits are won only by exercise, and appropriate education is the sole means to this end. The patient must be drawn out of himself into other paths, which is the true meaning of education, and this can only be achieved by an educative will. We can therefore see why Adler's approach has found favor chiefly with clergymen and teachers, while Freud's approach is fancied by doctors and intellectuals who are one and all bad nurses and educators. Okay, now just want to point out I have a few comments and side notes here in these pages, so I guess I thought that the next paragraphs were pretty important. Paragraph 153. Each stage in the development of our psychology has something curiously final about it. Catharsis, with its heartfelt outpourings, makes one feel, now we are there. Everything has come out, everything is known, the last terror lived through, and the last tear shed. Now everything will be all right. Elucidation says that with equal conviction, now we know where the neurosis came from. The earliest memories have been unearthed, the last roots dug up, and the transference has nothing but the wish-fulfilling fantasy of a childhood paradise, of a relapse into family romance. The road to a normally disillusioned life is now open. Finally comes education, pointing out that no amount of confession and no amount of explaining can make the crooked plant grow straight. But that it must be trained upon the trellis of the norm by the gardener's art. Only then will normal adaptation be reached. This paragraph 154. This curious sense of finality which attends each of the stages, accounts for the fact that there are people using cathartic methods today who have apparently never heard of dream interpretation. Freudians who do not understand a word of Adler, and Adlerians who do not wish to know anything about the unconscious. Each is ensnared in the peculiar finality of his own stage, and thence arises the chaos of opinions and views which makes orientation in these troubled waters so exceedingly difficult. Whence comes the feeling of finality that evokes so much authoritarian bigotry on all sides? Paragraph 156. I can only explain it to myself by saying that each stage does in fact test on a final truth, and that consequently there are always cases which demonstrate this particular truth in the most startling way. In our delusion-ridden world, a truth is so precious that nobody wants to let it slip merely for the sake of a few so-called exceptions which refuse to toe the line. And whoever doubts this truth is invariably looked on as a faithless reprobate. um, and whoever doubts this truth is invariably looked upon as a faithless reprobate, so that a note of fanaticism and intolerance everywhere creeps into the discussion. Paragraph 157. And yet each of us carry the torch of knowledge but a part of the way, until another takes it from him. If only we could understand all this impersonally, could understand that we are not the personal creators of our truths, but only their exponents, mere mouthpieces of the day's psychic needs, then much venom and bitterness might be spared, and we should be able to perceive the profound and suprapersonal continuity of the human mind. Paragraph 158. As a rule, we take no account of the fact that the doctor who practices catharsis is not just an abstraction which automatically produces nothing but catharsis. He is also a human being, and although his thinking may be limited to his special field, his actions exert the influence of a complete human being. Without giving it a name and without being clearly conscious of it, he unwittingly does his share of explanation and education, just as the others do their share of catharsis without raising it to the level of a principle. Paragraph 159. All life is living history. Even the reptile still lives in us, parsu entendu. In the same way, the three stages of analytical psychology so far dealt with in the same way, the three stages of analytical psychology so far dealt with are by no means truths of such a nature that the last of them has gobbled up and replaced the other two. On the contrary, all three are salient aspects of one and the same problem, and they no more invalidate one another than do confession and absolution. Paragraph 160. And just to summarize here, I'm going to read to you my parenthetical note down here, because there are four stages of development, and so far he's only talked about three. And so I just wanted to put them all together in one place. So 4 stages of development. One is catharsis. You know everything. Number two is elucidation, where it came from. Number 3 is education. We're all like that. And number 4 which we haven't done yet, is transformation. And it's during the earlier ones that the transference occurs, where um, it becomes a wish-fulfilling fantasy. In other words, the analysand replaces their father with a father figure in the analyst, or the female analyst might replace the mother. And so they're giving a context for this fantasy. And an important point here is that we're all living history. Okay, paragraph 160. The same is true of the fourth stage, transformation. It too should not claim to be the finally attained and only valid truth. It certainly fills a gap left by the earlier stages, but in so doing, it merely fulfills a further need beyond the scope of the others. Paragraph 161. In order to make clear what this fourth stage has in view and what is meant by the somewhat peculiar term transformation, we must first consider what psychic need was not given a place in the earlier stages. In other words, can anything lead further or be higher than the claim to be a normal and adapted social being? To be a normal human being is probably the most useful and fitting thing of which we can think, but the very notion of a normal human being, like the concept of adaptation, implies a restriction to the average, which seems a desirable improvement only to the man who already has some difficulty in coming to terms with the everyday world. A man, let us say, whose neurosis unfits him for normal life. To be normal is the ideal aim for the unsuccessful, for all those who are still below the general level of adaptation. But for people of more than average ability, people who never found it difficult to gain success and to accomplish their share of the world's work, for them, the moral compulsion to be nothing but normal signifies the bed of Procrustes, deadly and insupportable boredom, a hell of sterility and hopelessness. Consequently, there are just as many people who become neurotic because they are merely normal as there are people who are neurotic because they cannot become normal. That it should enter anyone's head to educate them to normality is a nightmare for the former, because their deepest need is really to be able to lead abnormal lives. Paragraph 162. A man can find satisfaction and fulfillment only in what he does not yet possess, just as he can never be satisfied with something of which he has already had too much. To be a social and adapted person has no charms for one to whom such an aspiration is child's play. Always to do the right thing becomes a bore for the man who knows how, whereas the eternal bungler cherishes a secret longing to be right for once in some distant future. Paragraph 163. The needs and necessities of mankind are manifold. What sets one man free is another man's prison. So also with normality and adaptation, even if it be a biological axiom that man is a herd animal who only finds optimum health in living as a social being, the very next case may quite possibly invert this axiom and show us that he is completely healthy only when leading an abnormal and unsocial life. It is enough to drive one to despair that in practical psychology, there are no universally valid recipes and rules. There are only individual cases with the most heterogeneous needs and demands. So heterogeneous that we can virtually never know in advance what course a given case Just a minute. I need to do one thing here. I'll begin that sentence again. There are only individual cases with the most heterogeneous needs and demands. So heterogeneous that we can virtually never know in advance what course a given case will take, for which reason it is better for the doctor to abandon all preconceived opinions. This does not mean that he should throw them overboard, but that in any case he should use them merely as hypotheses for a possible explanation, not, however, in order to instruct or convince his patient, but rather to show how the doctor reacts to that particular individual. For twist and turn the matter as we may, the relation between doctor and patient remains a personal one within the impersonal framework of professional treatment. By no device can the treatment be anything but the product of a mutual influence in which the whole being of the doctor, as well as that of his patient, plays its part. In the treatment, there is an encounter between two irrational factors. That is to say, between two persons who are not fixed and determinable quantities, but who bring with them, besides their more or less clearly defined fields of consciousness, an indefinitely extended sphere of non-consciousness. Hence, the personalities of doctor and patient are often infinitely more important for the outcome of the treatment than what the doctor says and thinks, although what he says and thinks may be a disturbing or a healing factor not to be underestimated. For two personalities to meet is like mixing two different chemical substances. If there is any combination at all, both are transformed. And of course, this is one of the most famous quotes of Dr. Jung's work. So I'll read it again. For two personalities to meet is like mixing two different chemical substances. If there is any combination at all, both are transformed. In any effective psychological treatment, the doctor is bound to influence the patient, but this influence can only take place if the patient has a reciprocal influence on the doctor. You can exert no influence if you are not susceptible to influence. It is futile for the doctor to shield himself from the influence of the patient and to surround himself with a smokescreen of fatherly and professional authority. By so doing, he only denies himself the use of a highly important organ of information. The patient influences him unconsciously, nonetheless, and brings about changes in the doctor's unconscious, which are well known to many psychotherapists. Psychic disturbances or even injuries peculiar to the profession. A striking illustration of the patient's almost chemical action. One of the best known symptoms of this kind is the countertransference evoked by the transference. But the effects are often much more subtle, and their nature can best be conveyed by the old idea of the demon of sickness. According to this, a sufferer can transmit his disease to a healthy person, whose powers then subdue the demon, but not without impairing the well-being of the subduer. Paragraph 164. Between doctor and patient, therefore, there are imponderable factors which bring about a mutual transformation. In the process, the stronger and more stable personality will decide the final issue. I have seen many cases where the patient assimilated the doctor in defiance of all theory and of the latter's professional intentions, generally, though not always to the disadvantage of the doctor. Paragraph 164. The stage of transformation is grounded on these facts, but it took more than 25 years of wide practical experience for them to be clearly recognized. Freud himself has admitted their importance and has therefore seconded my demand for the analysis of the analyst. Paragraph 166. What does this demand mean? Nothing less than the doctor is as much in the analysis as the patient. He is equally a part of the psychic process of treatment and therefore equally exposed to the transforming influences. Indeed, to the extent that the doctor shows himself impervious to this influence, he forfeits influence over the patient. And if he is influenced only unconsciously, there is a gap in his field of consciousness, which makes it impossible for him to see the patient in true perspective. In either case, the result of the treatment is compromised. Paragraph 167. The doctor is therefore faced with the same task which he wants his patient to face. That is, he must become socially adapted, or, in the reverse case, appropriately non-adapted. This therapeutic demand can, of course, be clothed in 1,000 different formulae, according to the doctor's beliefs. One doctor believes in overcoming infantilism, therefore he must first overcome his own infantilism. Another believes in abreacting all effects, therefore he must first abreact all his own effects. A third believes in complete consciousness, therefore he must first reach consciousness of himself. The doctor must consistently strive to meet his own therapeutic demand if he wishes to ensure the right sort of influence over his patients. All these guiding principles of therapy make so many ethical demands, which can be summed up in a single truth. Be the man through whom you wish to influence others. Mere talk has always been counted hollow, and there is no trick, however artful, by which this simple truth can be evaded in the long run. The fact of being convinced and not the thing we are convinced of, that is what has always and at all times worked. I'm going to read that once again. I think it's important. All these guiding principles of therapy make so many ethical demands, which can be summed up in the single truth. Be the man through whom you wish to influence others. Mere talk has always been counted hollow, and there is no trick, however artful, by which this simple truth can be evaded in the long run. The fact of being convinced and not the thing we are convinced of, that is what has always and at all times worked. Paragraph 168. Thus, the fourth stage of analytical psychology requires the counter-application to the doctor himself of whatever system is believed in, and moreover, that the same relentlessness, consistency, and perseverance with which the doctor applies it to the patient. Paragraph 169. When one considers with what attentiveness and critical judgment the psychologist must keep track of his patients in order to show up all their false turnings, their false conclusions, and infantile subterfuges, then it is truly no mean achievement for him to perform the same work upon himself. We are seldom interested enough in ourselves for that. Moreover, nobody pays us for our introspective efforts. Again, the common neglect into which the reality of the human psyche has fallen is still so great that self-examination or preoccupation with ourselves is deemed almost morbid. Evidently, we suspect the psyche of harboring something unwholesome, so that any concern with it smells of the sick room. The doctor has to overcome these resistances in himself. For who can educate others if he himself is uneducated? Who can enlighten others if he is still in the dark about himself? And who purify others if himself impure? I have about 4 pages, maybe only 2 pages to go here. All right, paragraph 170. The step from education to self-education is a logical advance that completes the earlier stages. The demand made by the stage of transformation, namely that the doctor must change himself if he is to become capable of changing his patient, is, as may well be imagined, the rather unpopular one, and for 3 reasons. First, because it seems unpractical. Second, because of the unpleasant prejudice against being preoccupied with oneself. And third, because it is sometimes exceedingly painful to live up to everything one expects of one's patient. The last item in particular contributes much to the unpopularity of this demand. For if the doctor conscientiously doctors himself, he will soon discover things in his own nature which are utterly opposed to normalization, or which continue to haunt him in the most disturbing way, despite assiduous explanation and thorough abreaction. What is he to do about these things? He always knows what the patient should do about them. It is his professional duty to do so. But what, in all sincerity, will he do when they recoil upon himself, or perhaps upon those who stand nearest to him? He may, in his self-investigations, discover some inferiority which brings him uncomfortably close to his patients and may even blight his authority. How will he deal with this painful discovery? This somewhat neurotic question will touch him on the raw, no matter how normal he thinks he is. He will also discover that the ultimate questions which worry him as much as his patients cannot be solved by any treatment, that to expect solutions from others is childish and keeps you childish, and that if no solution can be found, the question must be repressed again. Paragraph 171. I will not pursue any further the many problems raised by self-examination, because owing to the obscurity which still surrounds the psyche, they would be of little interest today. Paragraph 172. Instead, I would like to emphasize once again that the newest developments in analytical psychology confront us with the imponderable elements in the human personality, that we have learned to place in the foreground the personality of the doctor himself as a curative or harmful factor, and that what is now demanded is his own transformation, the self-education of the educator. Consequently, everything that occurred on the objective level in the history of our psychology, confession, elucidation, education, passes to the subjective level. In other words, what happened to the patient must now happen to the doctor, so that his personality shall not react unfavorably on the patient. The doctor can no longer evade his own difficulty by treating the difficulties of others. The man who suffers from a running abscess is not fit to perform a surgical operation. Paragraph 173. Just as the momentous discovery of the unconscious shadow side in man suddenly forced the Freudian school to deal even with the questions of religion, so this latest advance makes an unavoidable problem of the doctor's ethical attitude. The self-criticism and self-examination that are indissolubly bound up with it necessitates a view of the psyche rather radically different from the merely biological one which has prevailed hitherto. For the human psyche is far more than a mere object of scientific interest. It is not only the sufferer, but the doctor as well, not only the object, but also the subject, not only a cerebral function, but the absolute condition of consciousness itself. Paragraph 174. What was formerly a method of medical treatment now becomes a method of self-education. And with this, the horizon of our psychology is immeasurably widened. The crucial thing is no longer the medical diploma, but the human quality. This is a significant turn of events, for it places all the implements of the psychotherapeutic art that were developed in clinical practice and then refined and systematized at the service of our self-education and self-perfection, with the result that analytical psychology has burst the bonds which till then had bound it to the consulting room of the doctor. It goes beyond itself to fill the hiatus that has hitherto put Western civilization at a psychic disadvantage as compared with the civilizations of the East. We Westerners knew only how to tame and subdue the psyche. We knew nothing about its methodological development and its functions. Our civilization is still young, and young civilizations need all the arts of the animal tamer to make Sorry. Yeah, I'm going to go back. I'll read that again. Our civilization is still young, and young civilizations need all the arts of the animal tamer to make the defiant barbarian and the savage in us more or less tractable. But at a higher cultural level, we must forego compulsion and turn to self-development. For this, we must have a way, a method, which, as I said, has so far been lacking. It seems to me that the findings and experiences of analytical psychology can at least provide a foundation. For as soon as psychotherapy takes the doctor himself for its subject, it transcends its medical origins and ceases to be merely a method of treating the sick. It now treats the healthy and or such as have a moral right to psychic health, whose sickness is at most the suffering that torments us all. For this reason, analytical psychology can claim to serve the common weal, more so even than the previous stages, which are each the bearer of a general truth. But between this claim and present day reality, there lies a gulf with no bridge leading across. We have yet to build that bridge stone by stone. And that is the end of that essay. That was written in 1929, so I would argue that perhaps some of those stones are now in place. Now, to my guest, who's going to remain anonymous here for the moment, I'm going to end this for the YouTube audience, and that will terminate the session, but I'll come back online in 2 or 3 minutes and give you the opportunity to speak to me privately. So I'm going to end the session at this point. Take care now.